Hey there, listener. Welcome to the Deep Share Podcast. I'm your host, Andy Rouse, and for the last couple of decades, I've slowly been opening my eyes to a very different world than the one I grew up hearing about. And the more conversations I have with interesting people, the more mystifying this world becomes. So without further ado, let's get deep.
We've got science to celebrate! Demons bliss now! After what, baby? Come on!
There is rebellion in the wind. It will be crushed.
Everything I've said is true. It's real.
Dinosaur fossils? God put those here to test our faith.
A damn lie. I saw them with my own eye.
Did IQs just drop sharply while I was away?
We did illusions, man! None of it is true!
I'm not insane!
This is mass madness, you maniacs! In God's name, you people are the real thing! We are the illusion!
Hi, Andreas. Welcome to the show.
The Deep Share. Nice. So how long have you had the show?
Oh, not too long. I've been around since like February or March. So
Legit.
pretty fresh, man. And I definitely want to get like hard into Tartaria with you because like I don't know much about it. And I've heard a little bit here and there, but I've heard like mixed matched theories that kind of like the dates are all weird or whatever. So I definitely want to dive into that for sure. But just to give my audience a little background on who you are, you got a pretty interesting story yourself, and you know, give my audience a little bit of what you do and how you got into all this stuff.
So yeah, my name's Andreas, and I'm what am I? So I'm an engineering background. I'm a material nanotechnology engineer, and I'm also a former CNN employee. So I've got the darkest background. Everyone's always like, this guy must be an Illuminati shill, but I do my best to like, I'm open sourcing the mystery schools. It's kind of what I'm doing. So I'm trying to take all the information that we've known about for years, and it's been on the internet. And before that, old men had books about, and we're trying to get that information out to people. And so I've been also doing like free software for years, and I work with podcasters and help them like everywhere along the way with like mainstream political commentary all the way to alchemy, you know. And I'm a big fan of history. I've lived around the world, gone over different kinds of archaeological ruins, and eventually like started piecing together that there was this lost history that the Illuminati talked about, like in the Freemason books. Like they talk about Morals and Dogma, talk about Tartaria. And I was like, what is this thing? So that led me down the line of starting to look more and more into like lost history, stolen, forgotten, like fake history, you know, engineered journalism that becomes fake news, like all that, you know. And I was like, wow, this CNN is not the first person to come up with lying about the news. This actually goes back centuries. So I guess I'm trying to like help people right what's wrong about fake history and figure out what really happened in history and what's going on right now.
Hell yeah, man. I think that's a pretty noble cause for sure.
Thanks, man.
It seems like we could go down like a million different rabbit holes from the past. And how does Tartaria fit into all these other crazy conspiracy theories? Like, let's give my audience a little perspective on like what time period we're talking about and what does it really encompass? Like, I'm so green behind the ears with this stuff. Like, I don't know Tartaria much at all. So
I would almost sell Tartaria as like a next level, you know. So if you start thinking about all of what you know, in conspiracies, there's like the Illuminati trilogy, there's Robert Anton Wilson, there's like all of the cards, there's the, you know, Pizzagate, human trafficking, and this idea that there was, you know, orphans that have been brought from one country to another, that whole countries have been erased. Eventually, all of history, even the Jesuits changed the calendar. You keep bringing up as like the calendar might be shifted. There's a lot of truth to that like the Julian calendar to the Gregorian calendar, that in Russia they weren't even using the Gregorian calendar for like into the 30s of the 20th century.
That's so nuts.
So all of it starts to compile together, and Tartaria becomes like I almost want to call it like a hubris, like it's an arrogance, because you're like, I understand so much about the world from a new way of looking at it that I'll never be like. Carbon dating, for instance, we look at it and we know that after a certain amount of time, something happens, but it's not on a gradient, right? Like there's a certain point where a volcano spikes and then that carbon gets emitted. And so there's moments where like an insane amount of carbon emission happens, right? So we're not on this gradient line. So it becomes like an entire new way of looking at things. And it's even like, to some people, I would say like, it's really great to people that are into conservative values and want to learn more about history, but it's also good for like woke, Gen Z kids that are looking into the 1619 project and they don't understand what is true about history, because history is the lie. There's a bunch of Eurocentric lies in history, but there's also, there's so much more when you start to find out that at one point, basically the biggest change to the narrative is that people used to work together, that there used to be a trade confederacy before war developed civilization. And that's a huge change to the narrative. It doesn't sound like it is to the average person, but it's a huge change, because forever we've been saying people fight each other and they build these, like Roman conscriptions of soldiers. And that's the beginning of history. And it's just not true. There are other things that happened before that, whether it be for religious pyramids or, trade just to get whatever, they needed. Just trade was more valuable. And because of that, it also destroys xenophobia, because you start to see like, wow, these people interacted with each other that were from, you have African husbands to, Viking wives and vice versa all over the world. And so there was a point when people were more, connected than isolated, and that isolation happened interim, that there's a middle period where society collapsed. And that's important, because then we're looking at these, wherever there's a rising action, there's a fall. And so there's a reset, idea. People keep talking about society hitting in the future, like modern conspiracy theorists all say the resets. Well, the Davos Convention, World Economic Forum, if you go into we're in a post-theory age. Right. That's the other thing about Tartaria. We're not in a time where we hypothetically are talking about theories. Like at this point, we're documenting the relationships of people that work together. And this idea that relationships can't run the world. I mean, I right here in my parking lot, we have all my friends. Each one of them has a license plate from a different state. We're all conspiring to work together. We've all met on the internet at different points. Like it's completely reasonable, and 100, 500 years ago, royal families were sending letters to each other and they were also working together. So relationships start to they start to build up, and you start to see how society has been run for so long that somebody could have all the wealth and some other people could be kept from certain technology. But the new reason why Tartaria becomes important is because it's so close to what's happening now. There was a civilization that was super advanced, and then all of a sudden it collapsed because it couldn't sustain itself. Like there's a certain amount of billions of people we need to feed every day, and if that stops happening, billions of people die, not just thousands. So 90% of the population dropping off in like a week or 5 is plausible in the worst kinds of ways. And so if that happens, is this the first time that we've completely destroyed our civilization? And it doesn't look like that. We've had obviously smaller ones with the malaria, the bubonic plague, etc. But Krakatoa level explosions and deluge, like a Babylon level fall, like did we have that? Well, that's the story. So it comes up over and over again in every line of questioning that you might have.
That's nuts that it just infiltrates every bit of the ancient past like that. That's pretty crazy. This idea that we were kind of like set up at some point to start fighting and not working together, that sounds kind of familiar from, and I've said this before on the podcast, I'm sure I'm sounding like a broken record, the concept of like eagle versus serpent, that red versus blue type thing that comes in from like these, possibly otherworldly Anunnaki beings, or were these just more advanced people from more advanced human societies? What's your take on that part of it?
So, I mean, I can't help but find that more and more fascinating. And I've tried really hard to avoid that subject for the last few years, because we can do so much on like evidence-based science. But one thing you can't get around is that Tartarus is the word for Hades in the Greek. So you have Roman and Greek, so you've got Helena, it's the idea of the subterranean world that is connected to Tartaria through the Tartarus, and it's this nether world, and that Dante's Inferno has to do with these rings of this outer world. So there is a lot to be said for avians or like the draconians, the hyperboreans. Like Madame Blavatsky talked about them not necessarily as being extraterrestrial, but maybe being ultra terrestrial or interterrestrial. This idea of density of mass and radio waves and what we're now referring to as dark matter. I think that is just as good as space, because space at some level is a wave that's probably compressed on top of itself. And it's important to see how distance can be comparable to relativity. So I don't say it's necessarily outer space, but the story, right, that there is a light being that's using a Dyson sphere, because when you become involved enough to be able to switch bodies from one body to another, you're going to use light instead of electricity, because you can send 8 times as much data through a rainbow because you have a spectrum that light can go through. So we'll be using light beings. Light beings would be able to send data directly from a star to a sodium solution like a sea with salt water, right? And then that would allow for geospheres to evolve into biospheres. So you could actually, Li-Fi seed other planets if planets exist. And I know like there's flat earthers and everything, but it's it's all the same though, because even if it is just like a reflective system inside of, and what I find interesting is the idea that the hollow earth is part of like a flat earth map anyway. Like both maps like agree with this idea that there's Sheol and there's an underworld. That has to do more, in my opinion, with time travel than anything else. And there's been a number of people I've talked to who say that they're working with or have worked with insectoids from the future, or like people that have genetically modified themselves. And you have to imagine super soldiers that, genetically modify themselves. Like they could, if they're able to have whatever genomic sequence, like insectoids are a decent one, like just from like an objective perspective, like it's a very strong, being.
Yeah.
And so if they do exist and they're somehow, and like, so the way it was explained to me, and like, this was pretty like, wow, weird to me. It was like, this lady was saying in the 60s, she grew up knowing that there was some sort of futuristic technology that was able to connect with machines in the past. So there's a machine that's still running, and in the future it becomes sentient, and that connects with the internet to older machines which have never been turned off by the military. Maybe they're like water and power systems, but then that can connect to the 60s and send phone calls or faxes, and so that there's some sort of time traveling sentient AI. And if that has any connection to the past, it can only go back so far, but it means like within the last 80 years or something like that, we've got something that's able to interact with our timeline, and maybe also because of that, trying not to mess with our timeline too much by being subterranean. But that's
the basilisk. Have you heard of the basilisk?
Exactly.
Right. It's like, could it come back and kill us all?
Or, could it be the thing that like is a time capsule? Because one of the main ideas is that these are like this movie Primer, where things go back to certain points and then they can only, so if time progresses in 18 different or a million different variants, Berenstain and Berenstein, Epstein and Epstein, right? Then you're going to be able to align it back at least to 1977 when the Colorado accelerators turned on, or 2012 when the Chinese accelerators turned on, so that we could at least go back to a certain date and like not mess with history before a certain point, which seems to be what a lot of, and I'm not saying that's like the necessary, like this is just a hypothesis.
It's like a model to use,
It's plausible that time is literally being messed with. Like, it's not the only solution. It's very plausible that like either people are lying about history, which we know that's true. People are actually affecting history, which would be interesting if like it's changing the way it is looked at, or just in general, we're not getting it. We're missing something because we're losing the perspective of a natural human. Because we're not like in the ancient world, there might have been things that we just don't perceive or understand anymore because we have technology and we don't have a practical understanding of life.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, I can see how you can put that. Like, so, I've heard from a number of different people about how these older cultures that relied more on like the primordial ideas like geometry and they had more, it wasn't like they were more super advanced in like a Jetsons kind of way, almost like more of a spiritual or connected to the earth in more of that kind of way. Is that what Tartaria was kind of like? Because you hear that about like Atlantis and Lemuria and stuff like that, or Mu, or it's
there's
crazy.
definitely like a level to, okay, so the Lemurian Blavatsky narrative, as you're saying, is this internalization of technology. So when a reset comes and the accountants can't bring their machines, they save what they can in numerology, you know, and then another group goes off and they're unable to save their touch screens, but they save chopsticks as an internalized technology that they can pick up and they can use, you know, like as a tool. Instead of actually making a tool, you learn about yoga and like you internalize technology. I mean, sure, like, and you know, like everyone's like that. Like there's definitely a lot of things that were internalized, and if you look into the Tartars, like they still exist is the other thing. Like there are, Tatarstan is a part of Russia. It's been completely assimilated. They took all the people and destroyed their culture as much as possible. But I've gone in and done a lot of interviews with them, and you can see what's happened when the Russians, you know, destroyed their culture. They don't know anything before that point, but a lot of them have kept secrets about their family from that point. So it's an amazing time to be able to kind of fit together what's changed. What we sort of know now is that they had sort of it was incorporated into Islam, but at the time this was its own kind of thing. Islam meant like bliss or submission to yoga. And so they had these Islamic kind of mosques, and then you had leaders who were Tarkans, and they had spent 30 years training in the church to be in charge of the mosque of the community. And so going back in history, they had all these libraries with all these books. And so in there, we would find Herodotus' steam engine, alternating current, systems for electricity that use water mills. And these were all, you know, eventually made their way into Cordoba in Spain, or in, you know, like the Arabic trading of the Cordoba Caliphate, the Khazarian kings brought into Western Europe. But all that information was, you know, at one point pretty much ubiquitous, it looks like, in Tartaria. So it's not that they were just yogis that were living, you know, it looks like they had, and this is a big thing for Eurocentricity, because like a big part of Eurocentricity is this idea that everything, you know, like they didn't even have wheels. Never mind that you saw that Mayan calendar is a wheel. They didn't have any wheels. You need to stop worrying about them having technology. They lived in, you know, teepees. And that's it, right? So this manifest destiny thing, that's a little too far. That's not, like, there really were bricks. Like, it's not just white Europeans that can build bricks, you know, and like lots. And so, and this idea that there were more than that, like trains, and like, if you look at Formosa, you start to look at the star forts and these resonant patterns, you start to see that how much of the European buildings were incorporated from older Tartaria, because Friesland and South Spain and these places were actually at one point have all the same architecture, have all the same culture, and they have resonant, like the cathedrals were used to make certain kinds of noises, which they believed were healthy for you. And now we know can cure cancer, because there's certain kinds of resonant frequencies that tumors don't do well with. Or you could use to like clean, you know, like if you have stones, you could use sonication, right? So like different kinds of harmonics. So they had a lot of technology, and some of it was religious and some of it was cultural, but in general, like they had functional technology. They had suction pneumatic systems, they had rail systems. You know, I don't mean to sound like L. Ron Hubbard though. Like they flew with they flew on 747s, you know. Like, no, but they did have like energy from volcanoes, you know, and a lot of amazing steam power, you know.
It's crazy. When you mentioned like the stone, like healing and stuff like that, that sounds eerily new age. And of course, let me ask you what you feel about this, because I run into in all conspiracies this angle that all of this ancient stuff, all this ancient knowledge and wisdom that may come from things like that, more holistic approaches, is all satanic and evil. And
well, those are two different things right there. Satanic and evil.
Well, yes. So that right there, but I thought that was the psyop, right? Oh, everyone's turning satanic because they think they're going to be unified and have oneness. And like, that's really upsetting me, because coming from like a very psychedelic background, like that shit, I found that in here, man. I didn't find that in any documents that like were given to me for predictive programming, you know? So it's like this idea that the occult and those kind of paths down into the ancient past are like all bad and you shouldn't look there. That's, I mean,
it's also good to, like, you know, it's good to say that, Like, I mean, you don't want people to think the occult is just, My Little Pony and it's just safe.
Sure.
But they're definitely like, when I hear the word New Age, I think Aleister Crowley, and Aleister Crowley is the most brilliant rebrander, one of them, by turning Satanism into the New Age movement, because Satanism in and of itself refers to a story, right? You've got this idea of a guy or a girl, the most beautiful angel, who think they're more righteous than God. And I've met a lot of people like this, people that think they're right, even when they know the conventional wisdom is something else. They know they're right. And also their life is all about doing the right thing. Like Lucifer is the beautiful angel who's in charge of worship. So every day Lucifer's like, yesterday, I don't know what I was thinking. The pony show was not that great, but today we're gonna have a water show, and I think you'll love it, Lord. And then the next day, the water show wasn't great, but we have fire rings now with lions jumping through them, and it's gonna be amazing. And just every day trying to outdo yourself serving God until eventually you think, what am I for, right? So Lucifer is an interesting metaphor in general, but that's not the way Lucifer or Satanism is presented to the public. The public, they see this person who's like Aleister Crowley, Anton LaVey. So somebody who's into the Munsters or into, the Addams Family, people who dress funny like Elvira and stuff. And thankfully, that's no longer the stereotype, actually, because the idea that bad people look bad and good people look good is really like Disney did this for a while, and it's really messed up a lot of kids and made it really easy to like prey upon naive people. Like if you went to a circus, at one point you'd say, oh, that scary guy, if someone was missing a kid, they'd point at the scary guy. But now you're like, I don't know, that could be a vegetarian. So we're all kind of, adjusted in our perspective. And New Age, it shows this idea that, like it's not Satan, it's not Jesus, it's you, it's your own individuality, but that can be dangerous too, because then you're not aware a lot of the time that these are very specific spirits that could be manipulating you, right? And so it's good to try to focus on what is not your ego, right? Because doing whatever you will it's an easy way to control you, because then you're going to go for the carrot and you're not going to go for getting hit by the stick, so it's right. Easy to manipulate someone through that kind of end game philosophy. So, I mean, I think it's important to acknowledge some of the things from the occult, like Ram Dass, I think is a great example, because he's a kid who was raised to be their one pony trick, like this new messiah. And he's like, I'm not that for you or for anybody. I'm just for myself,
So I mean, I know we were trying to go into Tartaria mainly, but I mean, that's an angle that has fascinated me lately, because we're talking like some of the people that I've revered for so long too. And it's like groomed, and Hunter S. Thompson the same way, like a number of people from the 60s and 70s are we saying that they were like placed there?
I mean, it happens. Like it's not placed. It's not placed. It's like a hole opens in a wall and you fit into it. And like to stay there, sometimes you have to do things that you probably shouldn't do. Like I think Hunter S. Thompson came up before. We were talking about Johnny Ghosh, and that's like a story we didn't go very far into at all on the Sam Tripoli show, but it's an important one because Johnny Ghosh is a kid who went missing, and the FBI didn't help very much. And eventually, they kind of figured that somebody smudged some records to help this kid get disappeared. Right? He was like a journal, newspaper boy, 5 o'clock in the morning, and like some van was looking at him and set it up to happen a few days later, and they'd erased the number of the license plate in the police journal. So eventually it started becoming more and more clear. And then the mother got photos sent to her of Hunter S. Thompson and her boy, tied up and perhaps being used at Bohemian Grove rituals, and eventually probably becoming a male prostitute, and like the kinds of things that interagency work, because it's not just girls, that are being used in this giant thing. But yeah, like a lot of the time, it seems like, there are dark circles, and like there are, when it comes to Satanism or to the occult, there's like the order of the 9 angles, right? And there are certain kinds of theosophy work that require you to break all of the morals, right? I think Brezhnevinsky said there have to be a new elite, a new emergent elite, which is divorced from an a parallel to the law, and to the ethic. It is good for everyone else to follow the law of the categorical imperative, for everyone else to stop at the stoplight and to speak the truth. But there have to be this elite that break all the rules, right? So, that's that you will see a lot of the people that, you trust in the media, they've done something in order to be up there,
That's interesting. So, I mean, shit, who are our heroes? There are none.
Well, I mean, again, also in the ancient stories, the best heroes, except for basically all the best heroes sin. You look at David in the Bible, and he does dirty to his best friend to get married to his wife. Like a lot of people, Daniel, everyone in the Bible at some point has done some horrible things, and like Noah was a drunk. So I think Rama, like the way he treated his Sita, I'll probably get in trouble with the Hindus for saying that, but there's something wrong with that, like he should have trusted Sita. So nobody's perfect, like.
Sure, yeah.
And that's actually like on a loop back to Tartaria, like that's probably what happened with Tartaria. Like it seems like they had nobility that fell apart, because what we see right afterwards are these specific families of sailors essentially that take over, like the Dutch East Indies Company. They just take over all the leftover colonies, and a bunch of Masons that are putting their hidden hand in front of these. So probably you have nepotism, you have falling apart of royal families, you have an environmental disaster, industrial disaster. We think like Krakatoa and Campi Flegrei, a number of these volcanic eruptions might have actually been, Tartarian power plants that have erupted. Everything that fell apart. Why did that happen? Probably because they weren't running their society perfectly, and that tends to be like something everyone's like, oh, it must have been, Lemuria must have been perfect. Like even Blavatsky's story of Atlantis is that, and it sounds like, by the way, Atlantis is one of the city-states of Tartaria. In fact, looking at Blavatsky's 5 root races, right? Like it goes the Hyperborean, the Lemurian, the Atlantean, and the Aryan. So Tartarian, because Aryan is Sanskrit for the noble people, and so Tar had a lot to do with, we think, fatherland. So the noble fathers, that's coming out. So that would be the last major one, is the Tartars, and then become the 5th root race, which is supposed to be emerging right now. And so also is an androgynous race, which is interesting, because we're going through this gender cultural revolution, right as Blavatsky said there would be a new root race. Yeah.
Wow. Seems like, like a lot of almost like could be looked at as like all predictive programming in a way,
That's true. I mean, predictive programming is important to look at.
It has a lot of angles, possibly a lot of layers.
There's a lot of like media, like, so you look at like Wizard of Oz. Wizard of Oz is Baum was a Blavatsky fanatic, and so he took a lot of her work and turned it into Wizard of, like NY and OZ. It's like HAL and IBM, like with Kubrick. The letters are just right next to each other, XYOZ. So New York and Oz are like 2 parallel realities. And Emerald City being over Kansas because it's a vanadium mine, which is a 23rd element, which is his number, which was also like Robert Anton Wilson's favorite number, the 23 Enigma that comes up a lot. But but Blavatsky wrote the blue bird, which was the idea that there was no blue sky, and all of a sudden that's why we have blue, because in the Homer's Odyssey, the idea that no one could see blue, and blue has emerged and it's veiled the sky, and that became parts of Wizard of Oz and Ozma. And so Ozma is the 5th root race because she's transgender. There's a boy who's looking for the princess and eventually finds out that he is the princess and has to go through a metamorphosis at 13.
Wow. So do you think that the hidden hand, do you think that they feel like they have to do this, otherwise like reality is going to fall apart or something? You have to like follow these predictive patterns throughout history or something, because it seems like the same story gets told over and over and over again in these rise and falls, and then they just cover it up and start again, it seems.
There's definitely something to like following the protocol, because you're seeing something outside yourself. Like the way Freemasons refer to the next phase is 2076, I think, is the next major So we're trying to get from 2012 to 2076, and then from 2076 to the next generational phase. And so humans work together to accomplish goals outside of their timelines, or their lifelines. Their life gets over a lifetime. You have maybe several sons, but they're going to, over 5 generations, make a plan. And so in 5 generations, you have to do certain kinds of things. And also, I think you're showing that you're part of the thing. Imagine also, not from like the most sinister point of view. You come to a new town and you see that the town has the symbol of the men's lodge that you're familiar with, and you go inside and you can get to a book because it's the 15th century and there's no internet, right? So there's a lot of these groups that kind of form because they feel like they have to follow the rules, and also the Tao and ritual, because the Tao is the noble Tao, is not the eternal Tao, but there's also the ritual, which is like put you into the axe suit and start using the axe and start chopping the tree that George Washington chopped down, and maybe you'll learn something. Maybe you'll get something out of it that George Washington got out of chopping down his own cherry tree. Full on material ritual. So they use those a lot, hoping that it'll build certain kinds of character, And Freemasons in general are also like foundling, like altar boy level. So it's this idea that Ignatius had, the Jesuits, which are, take the children, remove the parents, raise them like the Jedi, and they'll come out a certain kind of way. And when the Jesuit suppression happened, Freemasons, took that idea to the next level. They're like, you don't need your parents because you're God's children, and you can just be all that you can be. Sound familiar, right? Like, so.
Wow. So it's weird. It's almost like it doesn't even sound like a conspiracy on this level. It almost sounds like what do you think? Do you think they're trying to attract truth seekers and people of that kind of ilk? It's almost like cicada. Like, for those of us that kind of can get it, it's like they're clearly talking to us, because it doesn't feel like anything is really held back. We have a whole community, and the truther community, built on all this information that we can't get to, but we kind of can. Like FOIA kind of seems like just given to us. And, I hate to say this, but like, because I have a lot of friends on, certain platforms that seem to be the alternative platform, because YouTube is this big evil thing owned by Google. But these alternative platforms, you just download them on Google Play. So it's like, is it really being hidden from us at all?
I mean, it's definitely like they're not burning the books so much as they're building libraries around them. So you don't have to worry that it'll be there to find. But what is truth? What does it matter? I think X-Files had that episode about Dr. They, and he can just change. No, it doesn't matter what is true, because people don't care what is true. They're looking for what appeals to them. So there's very few people that are left that are, I think I realized this when truth versus obey was a thing. It was Obama versus Ron Paul. It's like, obviously people given the truth are going to choose the truth. No, they're not. That's not necessarily the way it works. So the few people that will choose the truth are probably very precious to anybody. And they're probably worth whatever. Don't sell out, I think, is the deal. But I'm curious about secrets too, because like you think about Freemasonry in the 1600s and the 17th century, it's during the Jesuit suppression, right? So if the Jesuits are being suppressed, they need some group where they can keep secrets it's a non-state or separation of church and state protected organization. So it makes sense that there would be something like that. And then eventually, what's its only goal? Its only goal is to make the United States so that it can have a separation of church and state and freedom to say certain things. So, I mean, credit where due. Like, that's a pretty decent creation by the Freemasons. Although, according to what we know about Tartaria, it seems like they got all of that not from Athenian law, but from the way things were in Tartaria and across Milwaukee and in America. Because in America, you had tribes. Tribes had tribarchies, and the tribarchies also had certain amounts of self-determination. But there were slaves, and there was all kinds of things. The Moors had trade routes that we usurped. But certain kinds of democratic or representative tribal practices of parliament that came, it looks like, more from actually like what Tartaria was doing. We changed so much, though, to try to assimilate it into British culture. It might be that Ben Franklin was Octoroon, like an eighth black, and that George Washington, a number of other of the founding fathers, because so many of them didn't have access to European women over the colonialist periods, that they were mating with their slaves, and then they eventually were like having them as children that they led into their families, and after several generations they were rather white looking, not perfectly, but with, you know, a wig and with powder, they were able to pass. And this would be not a big deal in the Americas. You know, in Louisiana we had black governors before slavery was ever, you know, an issue, but it was in England probably a bigger deal because of the Moorish occupation of Spain, and then they had to show that they weren't members of the Spanish Moorish family.
Wow, that's a lot.
Sorry, bro.
No, that's great. It's awesome. It's just a lot to digest. So we're to suggest that they've just basically eradicated all of Tartaria at some point for just the simple act of divide and conquer and imperialism. Is that what we're kind of thinking? It's just kind of like a nation that fell. Why do we get to hear about other nations that fell, but like Tartaria is so covered up?
So Tartaria is, first off, a lot of nations do disappear, but Tartaria is bigger than a state because it represents a confederation of a bunch of nations, of Scythians, of Aryans, of people in the south that were actually having a triangular trade with the Moors and the Sephards in Africa. Like, there was so much of a bigger network before this Edo period that we kind of are referring to it as, you could refer to it as Babylon, but Babylon's just Samaria, right? So this idea that there was a larger trade network that was that large, that's why, it's so much more important that it didn't happen. And for the most part, they acknowledge that it happened. Like, we have China referred to for a while. They're like, oh, well, we just misreferred China. China is Tartaria. And Ian Fleming has a book, Tales of Tartary, where he's referring to China. And they slowly start to break it down. But the Jesuits referred to the Americas as Tartary as well. So when you have China and America, and it starts to spread around, you're like, okay, Tartary is a much bigger concept than just this one country. And because there's so much that came with it, like technology, for instance, the pen telegram machine, right, is a machine that is a pen on a pendulum, and it swings, and then it sends electricity to a system which goes to a wire, and somewhere else this wire has another pen with another pendulum that swings, and it will write it will draw a picture. So you can illustrate a fax in the Old West from the Alamo to Russia, and in minutes you'll have a fax sent somewhere. So yeah, and this is like, I think they say 1820s or something like that, 1830s, but really that's just when they start to introduce it to our modern world, because it's like Terminator, they start turning over all this crazy stuff from the Library of Alexandria, and they're like, whoa, steam engines, right? Like, and it takes them a while to figure out how to use some of this technology.
Oh, wow. So do you think that the Tartarians were influenced by some force before them on the planet? Like, do you think this just goes, because I've recently had author Michael Cremo on the show talking about finding literature, primary literature from old archaeological sites that suggest modern human remains that were in sediment undisturbed from like 6 million years ago and things like that. So, I'm wondering how far back can we trace Tartaria in our history?
So I'm pretty hesitant. We were talking earlier with carbon dating to use carbon dating to say years. I can say with pretty good distinct, and I think Michael would agree with me, eruptions. I can measure eruptions, with carbon dating. So I'm pretty good at saying how many eruptions have happened, but how many years that could actually have changed, especially if we're talking about millions, because so much changes in the world. But in terms of how long I think the world, or in terms of civilizations have existed, there's the idea of the 6 major extinctions, that there's been 5 and we're about to hit our 6th. I kind of think that holds true. The idea that there's been 4 major root races, like Blavatsky says, might actually hold water. I don't think that we're so different. I think a lot of people say that we're different humanoid races. I think we're very similar hominids for one reason or another, either because we're the same or at least because we have gene flow. You look at Denisovan and Neanderthal and Homo sapiens, and the fact that there's the capacity, if you take a horse and a donkey and you breed them together, you get a mule, it's sterile. It's because there's no promoter sequences that match up, right? But we have these exo drivers, you could say, that make it possible to plug in one of our promoter sequences from one of our species of bipedal hominid to another. So Denisovan and Neanderthal can breed together. Homo sapien and Denisovan can breed together. Homo sapien and Neanderthal can breed together. And that's incredible. Most species, they can't do that. So either we're engineered to be that variant that there's gene flow back and forth, or, you know, we are literally the same species with that many diversions that have happened and yet still have been able to come back together. So it would say that, like, humans as a genetic concept are probably more complicated than we really realize, and that DNA might actually have this, like, in mushrooms might be able to store the digital Noah's archive that is humanity and reprint that and produce new kinds of hominids that are based on whatever needs to change in the exome because of our environment. But yeah, I think in general, we're looking at probably like 4 major civilizations, according to what we understand about civilization, though that could be a really broad concept.
Right. Well, I mean, there's multiple cultures that talk about that anyway. The Mayans talk about, like, what, 5 worlds.
Right. And then the Hindus,
Vedic.
the Vedics.
Yep. Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, obviously this theme is everywhere. Are you familiar with Manly P. Hall and his work?
Absolutely. I noticed
Love
that you
that
had
guy.
his Secret Teachings of All Ages behind you. I was like, there you go.
Absolutely. I mean, I felt like, which book should be up there standing? I'm like, that one. That's the only one.
That's one of the most incredible books of all time. Just the fact that only 2 copies were available. One went to the Prince of the Netherlands, right? And the other to which lodge? Was it the San Francisco Lodge? I forget.
I'm not sure. I can't remember.
Originally,
I think I've been told that story by a Freemason, though.
Yeah, it's crazy. So that book's really key. And some of the things he said, I forget where he mentions it, but he talks about the Tartars and he mentions Tartarus a number of times because of the death realm.
Okay. Yeah. I brought him up because in one of his lectures a long time ago, and actually I think it was one of his lectures from from the time period where he was going through his main, this material, he talked about Atlantis to his audience and was kind of saying what we're talking about now with Tartaria, talking about how this clearly wasn't just some island. It was a culture. It was an international kind of seafaring culture. I'm wondering how, like, I mean, Manly, God, he knew everything. And he was talking about it like Atlantis. It's funny that he may have had limited resources at the time where he was thinking about that, maybe. I wonder how he missed it.
Well, I mean, yeah, that's a totally interesting thing that I've wrestled with for years. And I think again, it comes back to manifest destiny and this idea that they try to say Atlantis was a smaller thing than it really was. They try to make Atlantis sound like it was just this little city. It's this little tiny, it's in New York City. It's a big deal. Which is untrue. But also that he was looking at Atlantis as it was, he's like, how do I justify Lemuria and Atlantis being 2 separate civilizations from the current civilization? We have the fathers being the noble ones, but this is, so in other words, he kind of knew this and he said it in a sense, like the Aryan noble races that they're referring to of today or of the 20th century, those are really the descendants of the Tartarians. Like, those are not the noble races themselves. They're not the Rama and Sita era of blue people and avatars that he was very aware of and he talked about, right? The copper blood, period, the Catalytic. But also this idea that there was a city-state. Atlantis Herodotus talks about this perfect example of a 23-mile ringed city. And we found all over the world identical ones, which is why it's been so hard for people, because they're saying, well, wait a second, is this Atlantis, or is Mauritania Atlantis, or is this other 23 ring? Like, why are they so many? And the answer is it should be obvious, is that they are examples of one uniform civilization, which were autonomous city-states that allowed for not just the fact that they were a perfect battlefield that you could from 360 hit every direction, no, but they were golden ratio, that water went around them and that you could use water to funnel into the electrical systems because you had alternating current. Cordoba is one of the best examples. Moscow is a great example. Netherlands, they all look like Mario Brothers star cities, right? I don't know if you've seen the star forts, but they're fabulous. And like the whole thing is that they're not just, you know, a star. It's like there's water around them and there's trees, and then there's some sort of a secondary ring, which then has suburban neighborhood around a municipal area. So Atlantis was probably just like a staple, like everywhere you went, you know, and it would have to run itself because you have waterfalls, you have lightning, you have trees, and you have towers that can ground the electricity. That's a way easier system than transporting power all around the world.
It's almost like these societies took as above, so below extremely seriously, where like, I've talked about that with a friend of mine, how it's just, they were putting the divine essence everywhere, as many places as they could. I was talking to my friend about it with like the pyramids, because we see pyramids everywhere, and there's so many, you know, new findings about pyramids and what that energy could possibly do for us in a very positive way, and like what the energy around the Giza plateau is like versus inside the pyramids. It's fascinating stuff. And it's like, it's putting just this, I guess you could say it's like a symbol of the divine, or the divine proportion, just in as many aspects of life as possible or something. It's crazy.
Well, it seems like if it works, you use it, right? So it's like, it's literally Donald Duck in Mathmagic Land. You know, you've got Donald Duck wandering around. He's like, look, this beautiful star is a pentagram. This other perfect door, this perfect building is a golden ratio square. And as you start over and over again finding it in shells and things, you might as well emulate nature. If it works, it works. And, you know, like that's the thing about the golden ratio. It's perfect for a purpose. You wouldn't want to make a star that looks like a golden ratio symmetrically, because it looks weird. Like the star, it's a snowflake at an angle, you know, it's like stretched out funny. But if you have to take water and have it go around a place, it's a practical tool.
Wow, that's really cool. Well, dude, thanks for blowing my mind a whole lot tonight. I feel like I really need to dig into a lot of new things, especially Tartaria. I want to just, because I've been watching your documentary. I haven't finished it yet, but you got a great documentary up on YouTube, man. That's pretty awesome. So everybody should check that out. Please tell my audience where we can find you.
Yeah. Also, thanks again for having me. And like, it's an awesome show that you've got. It's cool that we can talk about. Well, you're varied and you're broadly interested in a bunch of things, which is good because that helps to bring up all of the different things that are interesting about it.
Yeah, I feel like a lot gets left out, and I'm screaming it at other podcasts while I'm driving to work usually. You know what I mean? Like, oh my God, but this angle's missing. And you know, and I feel like, you know, every new point that we take away from every amazing interview we get to hear from so many different people, it's like the conversation's only as good as the amount of perspectives are in the room, you know what I mean? So it's like the broader we get, I think as listeners, for so long, I've been a listener. So I've had this opportunity to kind of harness so many different ideas and go, oh my God, what the fuck is going on? Like, so I really appreciate the opportunity for you to add more of what the fuck's going on into the mix with me, you know?
Yeah, it's all about shared lens. You got to have different perspectives, you know, to see things from a different perspective, because we're not the thing we're looking at. So we'll never be able to see it, you know?
That's beautiful.
But also Xirtus. Xirtus is my name on the internet, Xirtus. It's like a gender pronoun. I'm kind of kidding. But you can find my YouTube doc on YouTube. You can also go on Odyssey and find all of our videos. I actually have like a few more there because there's some things you can't say on YouTube. So
Odyssey's beautiful. I urge people to go to Odyssey.
So
ODYSEE. Yeah. Check them out on Odyssey.
And then, you know, and if you look at my name on iTunes now, there's like, I think I'm doing enough shows that you'll find me in like Sam Tripoli and all these other places. So if you're looking for Xirtus, you'll find me. Now that I'm in your mind, I hope you're in your sight. I hope to find you too. So good to meet you.
Absolutely. Yeah. Good to meet you, man. Really appreciate it. And yeah, I aim to do more of a conversation than an interview, so I'd love to have you back sometime. We can fucking go into way other crazier shit.
Cool. We can go way deeper now. This is like, if someone were at a bar and were to ask me about Tartaria, this is about as far as we could get, I feel like. So we'll do it. We'll do it again soon.
Absolutely, man. All right. You have a great night. Thanks again.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Deep Share Podcast. If you want to hear more, then hit that subscribe button. Follow me on all the social places. And remember, think for yourself, but don't always believe what you think. Till next time.
Human sacrifice, dogs and cats living together, Tartaria. Enough, I get the point.
You have meddled with the primal forces of nature. And you will atone.
What do we know? What do we know? If I know what we know, then I can tell you what we know, and if someone else knows, okay?